Hi everyone and welcome back to our course. So in this class we're going to carry on making more improvements to our character. So far we've been able to make the character walk or move forwards and backwards, sideways, as well as following the mouse with the camera. And we've also put the movement of lifting your head up and down. So now we're going to give it more ability just to make things work better. So in this class, we're going to show you how to create the ability to increase or decrease the character's speed. Okay, so to make him run, as well as giving him the crouching ability, so it lowers his position. So if you're ready, let's get started. So we're here in the same file. Now what I'm going to do is just enlarge the floor as well. There we go, just so we have more space to move around. So now we've increased it, let's think about how we can add the ability to move, okay? So to do this, we need to go into project settings, okay? So this will help us to give a use a button to execute that function of speeding up the movement. So go to input, and here we need to add a button, but where and what do we have to do? Well, the movements at the moment are either true or false. There's no variation, is there? They're either running or they're either walking or not. So in this area, we need to think, well, how can we use a button that increases the speed and releases the speed or decreases the speed? Well, there is a button we can use in action mappings. Okay, and that's where action mappings really comes into play, or really helps us, because it gives us the ability to add the variation in speed. Okay, so here I'm going to add one, and let's just rename it. We'll call it run, and we'll choose the left shift key to trigger that action. So we just search in keyboard here. There are two shift keys, so that's why I've put the left one. And I can choose different commands for each of them. So I can choose for the left one, which is the more traditional key to use. And I'll also add another one for crouching. And the key I use for this will be the left control key. So this is one way to do this. Okay, of course, there may be others, but this is how I'd recommend it. And I'll add action maps here as well. I'll set up the keys over here. However, I'll do this another way so we can learn the other options that we have and increase our knowledge as well. So just so that you can understand the two options, let's have a look, and then you can decide which one's best. So if we're going to choose this traditional input way, I'd have to pull in the event when I press the key. So I'll just right click and search under run, and we should see an event here, action events for run. There we go. So we've got our input action run, and let's find the crouch as well. So let's right click and put crouch. There we go. Okay, so we have our run event. So this means that when I press the left shift key, it's going to trigger the event. Okay, and this node is a little different from this one, but this one here will control when the button is pressed. Okay, so it's going to execute a function, and I can choose a function for when the button is released. So let's move on now. So we've already set up the press and release button, so we're all good from that side. We just need to create the action now. So before we create this action, I'll show you this character movement function, because it'd be quite handy to understand this. So this is the character movement function, which is one of the standard settings when you create a character blueprint. So if you use this, if you click here, this is the details panel that's opened, and within this there are some really interesting and helpful details for our character's movement. Here we can start changing some of the settings. You can see that many of the settings already might make sense to you. For example, the gravity. So that simulates a physical body. So that has contact with the ground, that's not floating. Okay. And it also helps with the falling of the character. If you leave the floor area, then the character will fall as they will in real life. We've got maximum acceleration and many other things. So this is obviously orientated to gaming, but we can alter the settings so they're perfect for our character. Now, clearly we're not going to be using everything, but we can play with some of the settings and get it right for what we need. There are also some general movements in here that are useful. For example, how the character is walking, jumping, and falling. I think this part here must be for online gaming when you have multiple players. And there's swimming, there's flying, there's so many other things in there. But we're obviously not going to use them. We're basically going to use walking because our character, well, he's not even going to jump. In case you want to add this function, you can. You can tweak the jumping ability here. Now, in our case, we don't think it makes sense to jump in ArcViz, but I'll show you. And just in case you want to add it to your character, and then you understand how it works, and it's up to you if you put it into play. So what do we want to start with here? Well, in this walk-in settings section, we have a setting for maximum walking speed, and the default is 600. Now I'll press play, and the character, if we walk with them, the speed that they're doing is 600. Now we haven't gone through the camera settings yet to increase or change the ratio. So it looks like they're going slowly, but they're actually moving quite quick. But I think this speed is definitely too quick for ArcViz. So we can lower this value, and just so he's walking at a more comfortable pace. So let's start with changing that on the character movement. Let's go to 300. We'll half it. Okay, there we go. And let's see. Great. So you can already see he's moving a lot slower, which is much better for us. We don't want him rushing around our environment, do we? As we said in another class, ArcViz experiences are all about focusing on realism. So we want to reproduce this faithfully, don't we? Even in the character. Now, sometimes in our scenes, it might be more intensive on GPU, depending on how our scene is built. So when your character's moving fast, that can make it even more intensive. So we want to make sure our character's moving slowly. There's no lagging going on. And we've also reduced the mouse sensitivity, which helps as well too. So it's all about trying to replicate the movement of a real human at a steady pace. Okay, so I'll leave the speed at 300 for now. We can adjust it later if we need to. Now, what's the next step? So I've already set this part up, and we already saw how the character movement, the functions within that and different settings. Let's move on to setting up our running ability. So when I press shift, what does it have to do? Well, it has to run. So what am I going to do? I'm going to set up changing the speed through programming through Blueprint. Okay, so this speed of 300, we can alter that through the Blueprint. So if I'm going to set up something in character movement, I have to search for it as a variable. So I can add this here, character movement, to my Blueprint. So I've inserted the reference for it here. And that means then that I can get any of these parameters here for my Blueprint. So I can click here on this pin, just drag it out, and I can type what I want from the details panel. So for example, walk speed, and then get walk speed. And there's different options here as well. There's crouching speed, minimum, maximum, lots of options, all from our details panel that will work in the Blueprint. So we need to set up our max walk speed. So we set that. You see how the node changes? So when I press the button, it's going to increase the speed, right? So what's the speed? Well, since I put 300 in the details panel, It's going to be 300. So I'm going to write 600 here, which will double the speed. So I can either type it here or I can add a variable. But since this is a very simple thing, just adding a number, I don't think it's really necessary to do it another way. So we're using 600 as the speed for running. So if he's walking normally, it'll be 300. And then if I press shift, he'll start going even quicker. If I release it, he'll slow down. Okay, so at the moment, he's only walking in and running at speed. So we just need to do the setting for the slow speed or when the key is released. So how do we tell the engine that I've released the shift key? And to go back to a previous speed, we just make a copy of the set, drag released in, and change it to 300, the original speed. Simple, right? And plug in the character movement variable to our target. So let's test it. So let's look at the floor so we can check the difference. So now I'm walking slowly. I press the shift key and then release it. Simple as that. And if you want to adjust the speed, you can do, but a really simple way. So let's comment on that and we'll call it run, just to keep things all organized. Okay, so now let's do the same thing with the crouch function. So we have the input action now for crouch, which is great. And it's going to create an event. When I press it, it's going to execute the function. Now in Unreal Engine, there are some prepared functions that we can use, and they're really useful for this feature, for these movements. If you type crouch, you see there's crouch and uncrouch already there. So in this case, these are the effects of crouching: standing back up and, crouching down. So let's select crouch. Great. And I can already put the opposite movement, uncrouch, in as well. Let's do that there. So it's the same logic as the one above. When I press the key, it's going to crouch. And when I press the release, it's going to stand up again. Great. So let's test it. So I'm pressing control, but nothing's happening. So why is nothing happening? You probably already worked it out. What do you think it is? That's right. We need the character movement, don't we? We need the variable, because that's going to allow us to adjust the position, the crouching. Because crouch, if you type crouch in the details panel for character movement, you can find the abilities here, right? So here you can just have, well, you need to enable it first of all, so you can allow the character to crouch. Let's press play. You see that? So it's connected now to our character blueprint, a character movement variable. It's quite a harsh movement though, isn't it? It's almost like you got a problem with your knees, like they're clicking. It's like up, down, up, down. Now we want it obviously to feel more realistic, don't we? We don't want just to jump to the ground. We want it to be a smooth motion. And this is really a really important feature to include if you're using crouching, that you make the movement as smooth as possible. So let's have a look at another way. Now, instead of using it like this, there is another feature we can use to make the movement a little bit more smooth. Okay, so let's create this now. First thing is, without using Unreal's functions, let's make it smoother. So it's a kind of motion. Okay, so you can see that you can set up the height. So it crouches to half of the height, which is 40. But let's keep this number here just so that we can use Unreal's default. And we're going to change the movement. So how do we do this? Well, what is crouching? Well, when crouching, what's the camera actually doing? Well, it's simply lowering the height, isn't it? From its eye line to around here. So it was at a height of 58. And then what happens is it goes close to the half height, near the ground actually, to about there. So let's think about this now. Unreal's character height is 88 and it's lowering to 40. So we can keep this movement simply by lowering the vision to 40 because it's exactly the same effect as crouching, but we want it to be smooth. So we can do this by animating our camera. So to do this, we need to animate the movement. And we use a timeline for that. So we add a timeline in here and just give it a name. We could call it crouch. Here you go, crouch movement. Great. So I've created a timeline here. Now it's something we've already looked at before, isn't it? We need the float track and we add a key at the beginning. And I think we'll just use about maybe 1 second in its movement. And I think that'll be long enough. So we can do it this way. And then we can check afterwards if we need to adjust anything. So here we add a key at 0 first. And we add a key at the value of 1. And we'll turn the keyframes to automatic. So there's that nice smooth curve in the speed or smooth motion. So it's going to reduce as it gets nearer to the 1 second and speed up between. Okay. So let's rename this to crouch. And let's call it speed. So here we're going to vary from 0 to 1. And it should be a smooth motion. Okay. So that's what our timeline is going to do. So I'll create here the variable to control this movement quantity. I'll put crouch again, or crouch height. Okay. And I'll use it as a float. Put it here. And I'll multiply it for this value as well. So let's go to multiply and plug this in. All right, so I'll compile it and then I'll be able to set it in a details panel. I'll set it to, should we do 40? Minus 40, there we go. Because it's moving down in that position, okay? So it will move from 0 to minus 40 in crouching. Cool. So that should be correct, right? So what do we need to do now? What we need to do is move, don't we? We need to create a relative movement. So we'll use that node and set relative location. And what are we moving? Well, we're moving our camera, aren't we? As we showed in the viewport. So we use Cine camera. We're going to be moving that. And that's our reference to it. And we're going to be moving in the, is it the Z axis or is it the Y axis? Okay, so when I press this button, it's going to start the timeline. We'll use the values from 0 to 40, minus 40 in the Z axis. Let's test it. I press Control. And there you go. You see the effect? But there's something wrong. Let's play it again. So I'm here in this position, and when I press it, it bumps, doesn't it? Then it goes back up. So why is that? Well, let's go over the relative position again. And what's it doing? Well, if we check our curve, now we're going from 0 to 1 in terms of seconds. And when I multiply it, I'm multiplying it here. So it gets this information. And then it's applying a value of 40 times 0, which equals 0. So it already sets the first movement as 0, and then it lowers it. And 0 for our character is at the center of the capsule. So that's where we get in our problem. So it's using 0 as this position here. Because when we start, the capsule's already at its particular height, okay? But in reality, it's the center of the body. So what it does is when we press control, it dislocates the camera and moves it here. Now, I wanted to show this to you because it's important for us to always be careful with the locations that we're using, especially in crouching down. So when we look at it from above, let me just show you this. We have the camera here at 0, but on the z-axis it's on 58. So I can't go and simply tell it to use this multiplication function. That's going to confuse things because it's going to consider that the first value is 0 and therefore causing this bump to appear. So there are two things that we can do. We can either get the camera's initial relative position, which we're doing here. With the event begin play, we can find the character's motion, and then we can insert the sum variable like the class we did about sliding doors. So that's one way of doing it. However, there is always another way, okay? If you think this is too much work, we'll show you a simpler way of doing this. Okay, so I prefer to make the adjustments here because I already know the distance and the time, so it's easier to set it up here on this curve. So let's do it this way. And what I need to do, I can delete that variable as well. We won't need that anymore. Let me just fix the curve. So I have to start with the variation at 58, which is the initial height of the camera rather than 0. Okay, so let's check it again. The initial height is 58, which is where the camera is, and I'm going to lower it to -40, which is down here. Okay, that's down to 18, and this is what we'll represent in our curve. So I'll leave this at 58 here. Instead of 1, I'll put 18. Okay, so this is the movement that's going to be performed. So when we move it, it alters the Bezier curve. So we just need to redo it. And put automatic in both keyframes. Just make it smooth, right? Okay, there we go. Now we've got this smooth motion, and we should have the correct heights or starting points, still moving along the same distance and time of 1 second. So we have to put this into here, and if you press play, it should already be set up. Okay, so it should be starting at 58 and moving down to position of 18. And when I release the button, it should then do the reverse of going back from 18 to 58. So let's test it. Let's crouch. There we go. It's more smooth now, isn't it? And there's no bump. Much better. I think even the time of 1 second to crouch down is good. It's not too fast, it's not too slow. What do you think? I think it's okay. So if you think it's too fast or too slow, then of course you can adjust the time it takes in the animation, the timeline. And if you want to adjust the anything else, you can, for example, you can make it longer, and then you can adjust the height of the crouching as well, how low he goes. But you've seen the basic principles here. Okay, so we didn't need to use these, and although looking at how those functions work is helpful, but we can get rid of those now. So we've recreated it using a very simple method, but one that's more realistic, one that gives us the ability to act more realistic and more human, which is what we're going for, isn't it? Let me just comment on this, and I'll call it crouch. So that's it. That's basically what I wanted to show you in this class. Oh, and I did say I would comment about jumping. So let me show you. I'll do it very simply. If you want to include this in your character, you can do it, or you can leave it only with the crouching and running features. But let's do it here. Let's put here now jumping. for spacebar we'll use. Spacebar is what most games use for jumping, isn't it? Now, I've already got this function here, which is for jumping. And let's pull out, and we need to find our jump function, which comes with Unreal Engine. The target is ourselves, because it's the character that we're in. Okay, so we don't need to do anything there. So to stop jumping, we need to go to jump, stop jumping. Okay, so that's the opposite for us. It's great that Unreal comes with all these template functions. This is going to apply to the Z axis. Now, in case you want to reproduce it, this is how to do it, okay? And it's going to be similar to crouching, but it's on or off with the jumping, okay? If you want to, you can animate it, but I don't think I don't think that's a good move. But who am I to say that? If you want to animate the camera, then you go ahead and do it. Now, in terms of jumping, what's happening is, yes, the camera position is moving, isn't it? Now it's moving up and down. If there's an obstacle here, then the capsule is going to be blocked. So you're going to be jumping, but in our case, you're going to have to be moving the whole capsule with you, right? So it needs to have the capsule moving when you jump. Everything needs to move. So here we also have these settings under the character movement. We have jumping here, and there are many settings that you can use to control, whichever appeals to you. But I'll leave it here as default. We press spacebar. There it goes. It jumps. Okay, so spacebar jumps, and that's it, on or off with these functions. Now we can just delete that because we won't be using it in our blueprint. I only wanted to show you this detail so you could test it out, okay? Now, I mentioned about project settings in input settings that we only worked with the keyboard. But if you wanted to see how to work with the joystick or a VR controller or another device that's like a gaming pad that's not a keyboard, then you got all these other options, okay? The principles are similar. For example, if you're using a gamepad with a joystick with different buttons, maybe a PS4, maybe the touchpad for the PS4 or the actual buttons, or maybe using the Oculus Touch where there are several buttons, well, you can use them in the same way that we set up all the other buttons here. So you just choose your gamepad, maybe for example, thumbstick, right thumbstick, which is the one for moving. And you put the scale in as well. And I'd also have to choose the left one to use a negative value because it's the same idea as when you move left. So I'll add 2 here. And that means that the idea is the same, but you'd only have to set them up specifically for your device that you're using, okay? So same principle, but just bear in mind what is the control that you're using. Is it a keyboard or is it a gamepad? So we set everything up so far to move, to run, to change the speed, and to crouch. That's it for this class. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.